Hello, I'm Chelsea Jalloh. I'm a PhD candidate in the Faculty of Education, and to begin my presentation, I will start with a story. We sat on the sidewalk curb in the patches of shade cast from a scraggly tree. He was a squeegee kid whose work I had interrupted in my capacity as a research associate conducting interviews. As he paused from darting between cars, I asked if he had a few minutes to participate in a survey. He agreed, and we crouched away from the summer heat to begin our interview. We were about halfway through when his buddy ran over, breathlessly gushing that someone was selling oranges nearby, only 6 for $12. The interviewee looked at me and explained that he was sorry, but he had to go. I assured him that was no problem, thanked him for his time, and he and his buddy grabbed their weathered backpacks and took off down the road. Wow, I thought to myself, you are getting absolutely robbed by paying so much for citrus. A few days later, I relayed this exchange to my colleague Margaret, a veteran research nurse with extensive experience working with street-involved populations. I expressed the appropriate indignation that someone so clearly experiencing food insecurity was paying such an exorbitant price for citrus. She stared at me blankly. He meant OxyContin. I blinked. Those pills are orange. That's why people call them oranges. I felt my face grow hot. Of course he hadn't been talking about fruit. However, drawing only from my own experience, any alternative meaning to oranges did not occur to me in the slightest. My experience misunderstanding the term oranges exemplifies the idea that different life experiences lend themselves to the cultivation of different knowledges. More than just a difference in semantics, this experience demonstrated how the way in which I interpret the world has been shaped by the intersecting constellation of experiences I have had and information I have been exposed to. This experience may be vastly different from the ways in which someone else has experienced the world. In his work, Pedagogy of Freedom, Freire specifically addresses the importance of educators reading the world around them and honoring the knowledges, explanations, and experiences of the learners with whom they work. This orange experience reminds me that my understanding and the knowledges it reflects are just one way among what Michael Apple refers to as a much larger universe of social knowledges. The concept of knowledge within the education system is linked intimately to power and privilege. It is widely acknowledged that the curriculum does not equitably reflect the views, values, and knowledges of all groups in society. The concept of hegemony, the dominance or authority of one group, as observed through political, economic, or cultural influence, is particularly relevant to a discussion of legitimized knowledge. There is a colloquial expression that fish do not see the water in which they are swimming. Similar to the fish, we may not be aware of the pervasive hegemony that permeates all aspects of our lived experiences. In fact, Apple argues that schools are one of the most important conduits by which ideological and cultural hegemony can be preserved and transmitted en masse. The concept of hegemony neatly complements Pierre Bourdieu's theory of cultural capital. If hegemony is the values, ideas, and practices that reflect the dominant class, cultural capital is the ability to maneuver seamlessly among them. The cultural capital embodied in educational knowledge reflects the social and economic values of the most powerful components of our society. So, in the face of the narrow parameters of knowledge that are endorsed within the educational institutions, how might educators address knowledges that fall outside of the scope of what is historically defined cultural capital? One response to students who possess alternative or counter-hegemonic knowledges is an attempt to bridge the gap and fill in areas where students from the non-dominant group have a perceived deficit in cultural capital. Such an approach is often viewed as a means to mitigate the unequal distribution of opportunities in society by providing a hand up for those who experience the adverse effects of social inequities. Ruby Payne's framework for understanding poverty aims to help educators paper over the disparities in students' cultural and human capital by teaching students who are not part of the majority group the appropriate skills and behaviors to compensate for deficits in human capital. Geared towards students with experiences of poverty, Payne's program aims to teach students how not to compromise relationships by breaking hidden rules, otherwise known as the hidden curriculum, and to adopt the language, vocabulary, and mannerisms that breed success in scholastic and employment environments. As another approach, scholar Yosso concurs that cultural capital plays a significant role within the education system. However, Yosso contends that the very premise of Bourdieu's theory of cultural capital and the associated reproductions of inequality that are particularly observable as a result of white privilege within the education system are grounded in the premise that people of color are lacking in the social capital that is required for upward social mobility. Yosso describes that inherent in Bourdieu's theory is the assumption that if some groups are culturally rich, then, by contrast, other groups must be culturally poor. Instead of educators striving to, quote, fill up supposedly passive students with forms of cultural knowledge deemed valuable by dominant society, end quote from Yosso, Yosso agrees with Freire's position that educators must instead create learning environments in which there is space, appreciation, and value for the forms of knowledges and capital that students of color do possess. To do this, Yosso applies critical race theory to counter the dominant white privilege and instead center around the experiences of students and people of color. Yosso raises the approach of community cultural wealth to, quote, describe the array of knowledge, skills, abilities, and contacts possessed and utilized by communities of color to survive and resist macro and micro forms of oppression, end quote. The types of capital embodied in the 6 forms of community cultural wealth are grounded in the knowledge and experiences that students of color bring with them to their educational environments. So, what can educators do? In the words of Michael Apple, we can begin to question the unquestionable. In asking the types of critical questions outlined on this slide, educators can begin to uncover and challenge the hegemonic waters in which we are swimming. And, in doing so, educators can begin to move towards an education system in which all learners, particularly learners who are not members of the dominant group, can engage in education processes that acknowledge and honor the wide range of knowledges and values that have been cultivated through their diverse lived experiences. Thank you.